my biology presentation, I'm going to be going over ecology, which in the cognitive textbook are topics 1.1, C1, 4.1, C1, 4.2, C2, 4.3, C3, and 4.4, C4. So to start, the way and links that organisms live within communities is what ecology is. A species is a genetically similar organism that breed fertile offspring. Collection of genes are called a gene pool, which is what creates genetically similar organisms. A population is a group of the same species who live together at the same place at the same time. And communities are populations who interact with the abiotic environment and each other. So if you want to look at the breakdown of that, it's going to go species, community, ecosystem, biome, and then into your biosphere. Within these, you have different kinds of organisms and stuff like that. So like an autotrophic organism can make their own organic molecules, whereas a heterotrophic organism has to gain organic compounds from feeding. Let's close this. Bacteria can be autotrophic or heterotrophic, and each one has their own different kind. Each bacteria is either autotrophic or heterotrophic, whereas some are also both. It really just depends on what kind of bacteria you're looking at. Mixotrophs are a combination of heterotrophs and autotrophs. Consumers receive carbon compounds through ingestion and eating. Primary consumers are only eat autotrophs. Secondary consumers only eat herbivores. Tertiary only eat secondary, and carnivores strictly eat other consumers. Detritrophs use internal digestion to gain their protein and just that in general. Some examples would be earthworms and dung beetles. Saprotrophs use dead organisms to gain, and they use external digestion, so like fungi or mushrooms or other kinds of bacteria. Also within these communities and within ecosystems just in general, you're going to have symbiotic relationships. There's going to be mutualism where both gain from the relationship. An example would be spider crabs and algae. Communalism where one benefits but the other one is not affected. Like birds gain from having their nest in a tree, but a tree isn't hurt by it. Or there's parasitism, where one gains while the other is harmed, like a mosquito and a human were harmed, blood is taken from us, and then we have an allergic reaction on our skin. There's also a predator-prey relationship where one is hunted and the other is the hunter, so wolves and elk, or if we're going to go into people, it would be the hunters and the deer, any of those kinds of examples. Abiotic features include temperature range, humidity, pH of the soil or water, and this is an example of the nutrient cycle. So plants and animals die and it goes into the litter, which is just the layer of vegetation in the surface soil. Nutrients is released as the plants rot or decompose. That goes into the soil, then it comes back up, and the nutrients is taken up by the plants into the biomass, where plants that are plants and organisms, and then they die and it keeps going. At the very bottom, though, it also includes the soil, where some nutrients is added as a rock is weathered, things like that, and then it comes down, and some nutrients is also lost. And all of my pictures are from the cognitive textbook. We're going to move right here. Nutrient cycling moves organic molecules and minerals through the food chain and into the soil, where they are retaken up by plants and then by animals. Again, it just goes in a cycle of nutrients of how we gain it and other people gain it as well. If you're running a chi-squared test, you would do the total row total times the column total divided by the grand total will get you the expected frequency. That's just to measure nutrient cycles if you're testing it. Some limiting factors. A limiting factor is a factor that puts a limit on the size and growth of a population. Some of those factors might be temperature, water, light, soil type, pH, other things like that. Think if it's too hot for a polar bear to live in the Arctic, that would be a limiting factor. There are ecological niches. That's when a species contributes to its environment in a very specific way. A fundamental niche is the broadest niche, and it's livable for all species. Realized niche is a real area of existence in which a species is found. So it's a very more specific area that they're contributing to. Competitive exclusion is coming from multiple species competing over one niche, and a keystone species is a species that has a strong control over a community. And this kind of also, we'll get into it, but it goes into alien species and them competing over different kinds of niches. Ecosystems need a steady stream of energy to sustain their lives, and obviously the sun is going to be a major support for almost all ecosystems. Some energy is used for producers and is lost as heat. Arrows in the food chain, if you're looking at one, is going to follow the energy. And again, some of it is going to be lost at heat. As heat and energy transfers between levels is 10%. So the further up you go in the further down you come in a food pyramid, no, the further up, I was right. The further up you go in a food pyramid, the more energy is going to be lost. And the further you go in a food web, it's going to be lost. If you're going to look at pyramid energy, that's going to be your equation for it. A biome is a larger community that consists of plants and animals. Biomass is the total mass of dry organic matter. The FCR is the feed conversion ratio. And if you're going to solve for that, the equation is the mass of food consumed divided by the body mass gain. That's usually used for like farmers, ranchers when they're working on feeding their animals. 90% of energy is lost between trophic levels. And this is an example of a Grisham diagram, which shows how different soil, litter, and biomass can affect a biome. And this is going to talk about primary succession and secondary succession. Primary is when an area is colonized, comes from a lifeless area. And a secondary succession is where soil remains after trauma to the environment. Secondary, think wildfire. Oxygen is obviously our most common element. We all breathe it. It is produced from photosynthesis within plants. Carbon is going to be our second most common element. Carbon sinks and without proper weather patterns can harm heterotrophs because they're obviously going to be low to the ground. Carbonic acid is H2CO3. Methane is CH4 and is created in anoxic conditions. Peat, you would find in a lot of different kinds of biomes. And it's new leaves and litter on old layers, and it compresses it down, and that creates peat, and over time, there can be a lot of peat created. Carbon-based fuels are formed a long time ago, and they're what we know as fossil fuels. They fuel a lot of our life. Calcium carbonate is CaCO3. A reservoir is where an element pools. It could also be called a sink. When an element moves from one sink to another, it is called a flux. Methane and carbon dioxide have a huge impact on global temperature, which we know comes from the burning of fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide, carbon-based fuels, obviously. And that change can cause climate change. Human activity in the Industrial Revolution have also increased gases within our atmosphere. Humans, like I said earlier, we were going to talk about alien species and ecosystems. Humans typically are the ones to introduce alien species to environments and ecosystems. DDT was used during the World War, and it entered through bioaccumulation and magnification, and it was causing bigger issues than we actually realized through, again, bioaccumulation and magnification. It was going through more of the ecosystem than we ever realized. Alien species can harm ecosystems by making native species compete for food or habitat that they previously had to themselves. And alien species can be controlled by the biological control, physical removal, and the chemical control. That's how you would get rid of them. Bioaccumulation is within specific trophic levels, and biomagnification is within all trophic levels. So with DDT, an example of biomagnification would be if it gets on a plant and then an herbivore eats that plant, and then that herbivore is eaten by a carnivore, and then we eat the carnivore, that DDT is going to travel throughout that. Whereas bioaccumulation, it would just be within one trophic level. So that would be a herbivore eating the plant, and that's where it ends. This is going to be more about global warming. Can I make this smaller? Let's see. No, it's as small as okay. Okay, that's okay. Greenhouse effect is intensified by human activities, and that is what goes into our atmosphere to cause global warming. It creates holes in our ozone layers. Carbon dioxide and water vapor are the gases that have the greatest impact on the atmosphere. Heterotrophs and autotrophs release carbon dioxide, so even some of nature is contributing to global warming. The gases from water is water vapor. Methane and nitrous oxides are both greenhouse gases as well, and methane can come from animals, specifically cows. Climate change also includes rising sea levels, loss of habitat for animals, and changes in biotic factors. It is not just the greenhouse gases. Indicator species are, and this is going back again kind of into alien species and the loss of habitats. Indicator species are only around when a specific environmental need is met. Biotic index, you would usually study microinvertebrates if you're wanting to look at a biotic index. In situ is an on-site ecosystem, and it's the preservation and restoration of endangered species in their specific habitat. Ex situ is the preservation of species outside of their natural ecosystem, so that would be like a nature reserve. Richness, when you're talking about environments, is how many different species are in a specific area, and evenness is the number per species in an area. So you want a rich and even environment. The edge effect changes from the outside and the edges of an ecosystem, and fragmentation is just isolation within an ecosystem.